Welcome to the Human Optimization Project. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. Our topic for today is burnout, and this I think is a challenging one. One, it's really difficult to understand, often accompanied by some negative emotions or feelings, maybe a bad past experience, maybe a bad present experience. And oftentimes there's sort of a sense of doom and gloom because we don't really know how to fix it. We talk about it a lot, but it can be very challenging to fix it. Accordingly, we've titled our session today Burnout Decoded: Strategies for Individuals and Organizations to Understand It, Prevent It, and Overcome It. To help us answer this and work through it today, we have our expert, Dr. Colin West. Dr. West is an MD PhD at Mayo Clinic who's trained in clinical internal medicine and epidemiologic research. His academic work focuses primarily on professional well being, evidence based medicine, biostatistics, and medical education, and he's authored well over 200 publications and has won numerous awards. He's very active in seeing patients in the Department of Internal Medicine at Mayo Clinic, and he has a distinct passion for teaching and education. In fact, I was fortunate enough to have Dr. West as one of my professors of biostatistics in medical school. Dr. West, I do still remember a lot of that, but I'm hopeful that you won't quiz me on any of it today. I do not want to disappoint you. In addition to seeing patients, conducting research, and teaching, Dr. West is the director of the program on physician well-being at Mayo Clinic, where he focuses on factors that influence physician well-being, satisfaction, and productivity. He's been studying, researching, and speaking on these topics for the last 20 years. Accordingly, he's widely regarded as a national and international expert and thought leader on both wellness and burnout. Dr. West, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here with you, Chris, and it's great to see your career flourish and have a chance to talk with you about something that maybe is a little closer to both our hearts mutually with today's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you can see from that bio, you're a person who has embodied the concept of human optimization for quite some time. So I think you're in an excellent spot to talk about this. And I think the questions that we have for you are big questions. So we do have a tall task ahead of us here in this session. So I always like to start kind of outlining the big questions for our audience. So the three big questions we're going to try to answer today. The first one: what is burnout and how is it different from stress or general exhaustion? The second, what are the personal and organizational consequences of burnout? And then lastly, we'll start to talk about solutions. So our third question is, what are the steps we can take to prevent it and recover from it? So Dr. West, if you're okay with it, those would be our goals for today.
Sounds great.
All right. So let's jump right into and get started with that first one. So, how would you, Dr. West, define burnout, and how is that different from general stress or fatigue?
So, burnout is a term that, interestingly, in the last number of years has become part of common language and it's become colloquialized. And so, this question about definition is a little subtle, but it's actually really important because we throw around this term, oh, I'm so burned out right now, a little bit like we kind of talk about depression sometimes. I had a bad day. I'm so depressed. And I'm sure that drives my psychiatry and psychology colleagues a little bit wild because it's not a technical application of the term. Well, burnout's a little bit similar. So, burnout is not just I'm stressed, I'm tired, it's not a mental health disorder. So, what is it? Technically, burnout is a work associated phenomenon with three main components: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So, what do those mean? Because those themselves are a little bit opaque. Emotional exhaustion is this experience or feeling of emotionally having nothing left to give. And when we think about this in a medical context, this isn't being able to emotionally connect with your patients as deeply as you want to or you need to be able to do our jobs the way our patients deserve. Depersonalization is becoming callous toward the experiences of other people, dehumanizing them, having a hard time seeing them as other human beings and more as objects. Again, antithetical to the professional ideals of many professions, but medicine especially. And then reduced sense of personal accomplishment is this really interesting characteristic in medicine where very highly trained individuals who've built skill sets over years, even decades, still feel like what they do isn't making a difference and doesn't matter and that they're not effective. And so all of those kind of get blended together. There are measurement scales that are sort of continuous and complicated. The simplest way to think about these things is if you experience emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, or a reduced sense of personal accomplishment at least once a week, that is associated with meaningful consequences that we'll get to a little bit later. But that's sort of a simple slide rule, if you will, to think about, well, am I experiencing these feelings often enough for this to potentially mean that I'm experiencing burnout, not just in a colloquial sense, but in this sort of deeper technical definition sense? It is a chronic condition, not an acute condition. So this is not, I had a bad week, I have burnout. This is something over many weeks, months, sustained experience that can ebb and flow, but is more of a sustained sort of thing. So that distinguishes it from immediate fatigue, or I'm having a stressful day, or I've got, 4 operations back to back, or 7 meetings, or 32 patients on my calendar. Those are daily stressors. That's not necessarily something that is burnout. Burnout is more that chronic experience, again, tying into those 3 dimensions.
That's great. I like that construct of the three dimensions. And I heard you when you listed the three dimensions, you use the word or. You kind of said one, two, or three. So does that mean that you have to have all three of those to be considered burned out, or just some component of any of those?
You're getting into some really hotly contested controversies in the area that I myself try to stay out of as much as possible. I think moving beyond those academic conversations, we know that even having one of these is associated with important consequences. So what the way I talk about it is someone will have burnout symptoms or they'll have signs of burnout. And I kind of stay away from the I'm burned out, partly because that label risks putting an individual assignment to this when burnout is actually more rooted in the environments we're in. But also, it relaxes a little bit this sense of, well, I have to check all of these boxes before I take this seriously. No, if you're dealing with emotional exhaustion, we know that has implications for your patients, for yourself. Um, so whether that's full blown, highest possible severity burnout, or I've got important symptoms of burnout, I don't think really matters that much. It's something we need to pay attention to.
So, and what I'm hearing you say there is that this is not just a simple dichotomous thing. Either yes, you are burned out, or no, you are not burned out. That we sort of are living along a spectrum. Is that fair to say?
I do think that's fair to say, and it's an important comment actually, because we live in a time in many respects we want to simplify things into yes no dichotomies. And human experience doesn't often follow a yes no dichotomy structure. And burnout is similar. There can be more severe degrees of this. There can be, I'm sort of on the edge in certain dimensions, but I'm okay in other dimensions. It's multidimensional. And because there are 3 dimensions within it, it is actually fundamentally multidimensional. And that makes it complicated to talk about and maybe a little bit prone to oversimplification. But at the same time, I think it's important to not make it too complicated and just acknowledge there are multiple dimensions of this that all matter. And we can pay attention to all of those dimensions in a way that helps us get where we want to go, which is not just not experiencing burnout symptoms, but actually thriving, flourishing, optimizing our human potential.
So if we think about that construct of it being a spectrum, I would imagine on one end where we're dealing with severe substantial burnout, you're going to have high levels of the three components you just mentioned. So high levels of emotion exhaustion, a high degree of depersonalization, and a very decreased sense of personal accomplishment on the one extreme. Tell me what the other end of that spectrum looks like for somebody who maybe thinks they're doing okay, but is starting to trend in that direction of burnout. What are the early warning signs that folks need to be looking out for?
So, at the early end of things where a lot of us live often, it's helpful to have some ability, either self awareness or sometimes colleagues or family members will tell us this is starting to happen, where emotionally we're not fully engaging the way they know we're capable of, or we know we're capable of. So we've got a patient on our schedule, they've got a life experience that we know we should be able to connect with more, and we just can't bring it. And we we're going through the motions, we can check the clinical boxes, but there's an emotional connection that our patient needs, our patient deserves, and we can sometimes check ourselves and recognize, I just wasn't able to be 100% in that dimension. My patient got the technical care they needed, but emotionally, I wasn't as present as I wanted to be. Our family members might say, you seem a little detached, a little distracted. That doesn't have to be burnout, by the way, because that can be a sign of other things that we've already talked about. Maybe you're just tired and you need a good night's sleep, but it can be a signal that maybe this is edging into this emotional exhaustion domain. Depersonalization, a little bit similar. If we start, talking with our colleagues about other colleagues or about patients in a way that isn't as respectful as we want to be because we're dehumanizing people and treating them more as objects other than fully formed human beings. And I don't mean that always has to be overtly disrespectful or disparaging. I actually think that happens less commonly in medicine than sometimes TV shows make it seem like. But we can catch ourselves sometimes not honoring the full breadth of our patients as human beings or our colleagues as human beings. So we get a little sharp in the operating room, or I'm trying to get something scheduled with my desk staff and I'm treating them as a means to an end as opposed to this is a really valuable human being who's part of my team and I'm part of their team. And so having a sense of self-awareness or having other people help us when we're separating back from that. And then finally, the personal accomplishment one is in some ways the easiest because if you thought at sort of a mythical dinner party where people are going around talking about what they do in introductions, and you said, well, I'm just a sports medicine physician and I don't really contribute much to the world, other people would look at that like, what are you talking about? You are
Mhm.
highly trained. You are helping people live better lives in ways that are meaningful to them. Like, wow, I'm envious of the impact that you're able to have in helping individuals, their families, their communities. But if we can't see that, sometimes that's a sign that we're starting to edge into that dimension of burnout. I don't mean that we should be arrogantly puffing ourselves up with our self importance. But there is something critical about being able to say, you know what I do matters. And I do it to help other people. I'm not doing it for my own ego, at least not primarily. But I do need to recognize that what I do makes a difference. And that's actually wind in my sails. That helps me do hard things when that's called upon. When you can't do that, that can be a sign that you're starting to edge into a problem zone when it comes to the burnout dimensions.
Well, and a lot of your work has been done on physician well-being and burnout, and obviously, you and I both being physicians are very well connected to that community. For a lot of our audience that's not in the medical field, do you think that this can show up in the same way in their lives as well, or is there something unique about patient caregiving, or is this really kind of a universal type issue?
This is absolutely universal. And in fact, the decades of fundamental research on burnout started outside of medicine.
Mhm.
And so, certainly, caregiving professions have been a highlight of where the work on burnout has developed. But in any profession where the concepts of how we engage with other human beings are relevant, Burnout is something that can be a problem. And so it doesn't have to be medicine. I will say, however, at least by definition, burnout has to be associated with our work roles. So when people say, "Well, I'm burned out in my relationship with my partner," that's not burnout, at least by definition. Some of the same principles might apply, but that's now edging into more of a colloquial usage of, I've got personal relationship burnout, or I've got, you know, I've got kids' athletic activities burnout, or whatever it happens to be. That's more colloquial because it's not work associated. And the decades of work by people like Christina Maslach and others on burnout really constrained this to be a work associated phenomenon. So we try to limit it to that scope.
Got it. And another thing to clarify, we talk about people that are in different fields of work. What about different people? So if you have a different personality type, we're all different. We're all built a little different, made a little different, have different predispositions and emotional ways of processing things and seeing the world. So does burnout tend to manifest differently in people who have different personality types at baseline?
So the answer is probably yes, but I don't think it's as fully understood as it could be. And I also think uh, there's a caution here. Historically, we go back more than a decade. Sometimes people would look at, well, maybe an individual's predisposed to burnout. If we can identify who's predisposed to burnout, we can maybe direct people to or from professional choices. And in the early days in medicine with this discussion, there were a lot of leaders who felt, well, maybe we're just recruiting people with the wrong predispositions to be
Mm.
physicians. And so I just put a caution on that because I think that's actually incorrect. People that choose to enter any profession are generally committed, dedicated, passionate people for whatever field speaks to them. And often it's the field itself and the work dynamic that is bringing out the worst parts of their ability to grow adaptively rather than maladaptively within that profession. With that caution, there are some individual characteristics that we know in medicine, for example. We have a double edged sword with some characteristics of things like perfectionism and a little bit of, I'm going to use the word narcissism. I don't mean that in a sort of pathologically psychiatric diagnostic way. I mean that in a bit of a self-centered, we have to have a certain amount of belief at some point that we are uniquely equipped to cope with whatever's in front of us. And that's paradoxically one of the dimensions of burnout. This reduced sense of personal accomplishment kind of hits that head on, which can be a problem. But if we take undue responsibility because narcissistically we think everything is our responsibility and we can control the universe, and we take on that sense of dutifulness to a degree that is beyond what's appropriate, that predisposes to burnout and other dimensions of distress. And we're at risk for that perfectionist sort of thing in medicine because it does, when used appropriately, honor the trust our patients place in us. We need that. But if we let it get out of hand, then it can take on a life of its own and cause us to not be able to have any emotional reserve, to just bull through the day and treat our patients as slots on our calendar or cases rather than fully formed people. And we don't think about the meaning, the mattering of the work that we do, which then contributes to burnout being a greater risk.
That's a great point, and I think that you could see that too across all fields. So, if you think about people who tend to be controlling or tend to be perfectionist or tend to have high confidence or ego, I do think that that's something for them to be aware of and be on the lookout, which is probably true not only in medicine but also for athletes and artists and anybody else. One additional question before we move on to the next session. You mentioned earlier that it's different from certain psychiatric illnesses. So I wonder, is burnout an actual medical diagnosis?
This is a really important point. The World Health Organization came out a number of years ago to really try to clarify this further as well. Burnout is not a DSM-5 diagnosis or a specific medical condition. It's an experience that is related to what happens to us in our learning and working environments. And the World Health Organization was very clear that although this is something that can come up in medical discussions because it affects how we live our lives, it does actually have an ICD code in medicine, for example, or ICD 11 current. There is a burnout code for that. That does not mean that it is a diagnosable mental health condition. It's a human experience that does have mitigating factors and approaches to help, but is not something like depression or anxiety or schizophrenia that has its own psychiatric and psychological medical set of interventions. This is a really common human experience. And in fact, this has been discussed by people in the social sciences who do burnout work as something that needs to be framed as a normal human response to workplace stress and other experiences. So this should not be viewed through an illness lens so much. It should be viewed as this is what happens to people when they're in certain conditions. And if it's, a physical rub on your thumb, you're going to develop a callus and that can cause its issues. If you've got a workplace environment that is stimulating certain normal human responses, that could manifest with burnout symptoms. It's not a medical diagnosis that then requires a disease model of eradicating the disease state.
That's a great clarification. And hopefully, I think that can go a long way to helping people understand this, demystify it a little bit, and hopefully remove some of the stigma. Because I do think that in certain groups, there is still some stigma associated with it that keeps people from making forward progress. So we'll sort of shift into our next section here. I want to talk a little bit about the personal and organizational consequences of burnout. So we'll kind of think about this now for the rest of this session on the personal level and the organizational level. So you can tell me, is burnout an individual problem, or is it a larger systems-based organizational problem?
So we hinted at this a little bit earlier. And the answer, I'm going to call back to my false dichotomy kind of answer that the universe isn't yes, no. It's a little bit of both, but it is more system than individual. And that's a really, really important message because in many professions, medicine especially, we got this wrong at the beginning. And we spoke a lot about individual responsibility for how you cope with your environment. And we know it's really, really clear that the majority of this relates to the learning and working environments that really good, strong, gritty, resilient people find themselves in. In medicine, for example, we now know from national studies that physicians, despite the challenges that they face in their careers and burnout levels that are quite high and higher than many other professional groups, also have higher resilience levels. And so the idea that this is about an individual deficiency primarily is something that we need to relegate to the dustbin. That said, there is a certain individual component, and we can easily engage in maladaptive coping strategies. And so we have to take some responsibility individually that maintaining and strengthening our resilience, making sure that our self-awareness, as we talked about a little bit ago and we'll talk more about, is something we're paying attention to. We need to bring our best selves to our work. The system side of things is let's take these super talented people in whatever profession they're in, whatever activity they're doing. You mentioned athletes, artists, school teachers, doesn't matter. Let's take those individuals and give them the support they need in their working environments to allow them to meet their fullest potential, allow them to thrive in their chosen disciplines to their fullest potential. And the upward spiral that generates is compelling because if we give them the opportunity to thrive, They then connect with meaning in their work more effectively. And now burnout starts to recede into the background because they're doing things they love to do that fill their cup as opposed to depleting them. And I know I'm jumping ahead here and we'll get back to some of the solutions in a moment. But to the question specifically, much like we think in medicine about quality and patient safety concerns, there is a majority system structure that is responsible for safety or for well being. And then there are individual responsibilities to bring our best selves, our most highly skilled selves, to the work that we do. And that combination, that shared responsibility, is what makes things go.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it, and I love that framework of there being roles for both the organization and the individual, but ultimately looking at it as an organizational problem. Um, I want to hear a little bit more before we get into solutions. Tell me, well, I think we all sort of have a sense for the negative consequences of burnout, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. What are the negative consequences for the organization? And then after that, what are the negative consequences for the individual?
So I like that we're starting with the organization because again, if most of the driver, the majority is at the system or structure level, then we should talk about the consequences and why at the structure level we should care so much about this first. And fundamentally, it comes down to, as an organization, in whatever profession you're in, you have an objective, a deliverable, a mission. Your mission is delivered by the people working in your organization, in your profession. And so the consequence of burnout is that those people that you're counting on to deliver that collective mission are not working to their fullest potential if they're dealing with burnout. And so, whatever direction that takes for you, whether that's productivity, whether that's engagement with learners, I mentioned school teachers a moment ago, whether that's being able to engage with kids and their unique needs in busy large classrooms, whatever it is about their ability to do the work that they want to do and that organizations need them to do to their maximal possible effectiveness, burnout gets in the way. It is drag on their ability to reach their full velocity capability. And so, from an organizational standpoint, we think about this in medicine, for example. Uh, People dealing with burnout are uh, less engaged with their patients. They have lower patient satisfaction scores. They may engage in suboptimal professional behaviors that reflect poorly not just on themselves, but on the organization and erode trust for patients and their organization. We know that physicians, and this has been demonstrated in many other professions as well, are more likely to reduce their FTE, their work effort, if they're experiencing distress, including burnout. They may even leave a field looking for greener pastures. And there's huge cost to that. People invest years in training and developing skill sets. And if the reason they step away is something that could be intervenable and prevented through organizational attention, that's a huge loss. And it's disruptive for the organization. Selfishly, that's not good for the bottom line. It's not good for the human line of building a culture that is truly a community where people are supporting each other with common cause. And I think that's what people want to be part of. There aren't that many professions, in my view, where people just get up to, earn a check and they go home and like, I hate my job, but I'm there to just get a paycheck. It's hard for people to work in that kind of a profession. It's not very fulfilling. Most people, no matter what it is, they want to be able to enjoy the people they work with, feel like they're helping other people. And I had a conversation a number of months ago with somebody at Mayo who's non-clinical, who had previously worked in fast food. And it was a remarkable interaction because that person was saying, there are some people who work in this industry who feel like they're doing it because, well, I just need to get an hourly wage and this is the job that was available to me. But this person was sharing they never had that mindset. Their mindset was, look, this is the job I'm doing right now. I'm going to do it to the best of my capabilities. And they had this unique insight in that they were able to step back and say, you know what? I am helping someone else, helping hundreds of people a day do their work, take a break, sip on, hopefully appropriately nutritious food, and they're making good choices. But I'm part of the fuel for the rest of their day. That is more than nothing. That is actually a critical part of the infrastructure of what makes everything in our society go.
Mhm.
How often do we step back and think about that in the work that we do? You don't have to be a neurosurgeon on the front page of the New York Times. You can be someone in an otherwise often overlooked job and still be able to step back and say, you know what, the work I do makes a difference. And as an organization, the consequence of burnout is that your employees can't see that. And you, as a leader in your organization, have an obligation to help them realize that the work they do, no matter how large or small it might seem, is a critical part of the whole.
That's excellent. I think that there's a lot of really good information in there. And oftentimes, I feel like from the team or organization's perspective, when the topic or concept of burnout comes up, some groups will say, "Oh no, burnout's a problem. Okay, this is a problem because we have to pause, we have to stop, we have to address it. We're slowing down a little bit. Let's get this taken care of, and then we'll keep moving on." Not realizing that in the background nothing is working as well as it should be when burnout is an issue. So yeah, like you mentioned, it's going to be lost productivity, lost time, lack of joy, lack of meaning, lack of purpose. And we as human beings, I think, regardless of the field that you're in, we don't always do a great job of focusing on the meaning, purpose, and value in the work that we do. Whether you're in the healthcare field or any other field, there's always meaning and purpose and value that you're giving to people. And sometimes it's hard for us to see that at baseline, even when we're healthy and doing well. And so if we're leaning towards burnout, then it becomes an almost impossible task for us to do. And so you sort of see this negative spiral happening. And so I think that that really connects with me. I've worked in a lot of different industries and a lot of different jobs. Many of them completely unrelated to medicine. But as I look back and think, in every one of those, there was meaning and purpose and value. But it was hard for me to see at times when I was emotionally exhausted and disengaged and didn't always get it. Well, let me ask. So I think that's a great summary of sort of the negative consequences for both the organization and the individual. One of the questions I have: can burnout ever have positive effects? We hear these stories of these people. I was in such and such a field or industry and was miserable and finally burned out. I crashed, I hit rock bottom, and then I rebuilt myself from the ashes and came back to life. And now look at me, how successful I am. And so oftentimes those folks will sort of use burnout as a part of their success story. What is your take on that?
So I think the best case scenario is that people aren't faced with the damaging effects of burnout in the first place. But we've already discussed this is a ubiquitous human experience. The prevalence across professions 40, 50, 60%. And there's some variation, and we can quibble about which profession is, winning the suffering Olympics at any given time. But the reality is, this is really common in our current society. And so the idea that we're going to prevent this for everybody is not realistic at this point in time. And so, although I don't want to give up on the idea of a zero, you know, proportion burnout goal, the reality is we need to be able to grow from, learn from these experiences. And this is actually part of adaptive change. If you experience something and the only result of that experience is trauma, negativity, scar tissue that cannot be moved beyond, then that's a really challenging, difficult position to be in. And there are some crisis events where it's really hard to envision how that positive response could look. The helpful thing about burnout, in a way, serious issue, yes, but because it's a work related phenomenon and not something that is that needs to be an anchor to your entire human experience and is not a mental health illness or things that maybe escalate to a different level of intervention that's required to get to a more positive place. It is something that we can reflect upon and use and learn from. So as you alluded to, I had this experience. There was something about my job or my personal engagement or my leadership team that didn't allow me to connect with what I call the MVPs of well-being, meaning, values, and purpose, which you spoke to. We can actually honor that suffering by being intentional about considering what we can learn from it to grow. And that's where the positivity can come in. And it's not to say I'm happy that I had that experience, but why let it win twice? You already had the experience. So if it's going to continue, the aftertaste from a bad meal, like, no, let's learn from it and let the experience be in the past, but the positive response that I can grow from and learn from and have better future experiences be a positive. That's this sounds trite, but that's making lemonade from lemons. And there is something that can be meaningful and inspiring at the individual level in turning something negative and exerting your control, because you can control that. Not to say a good attitude is the answer, but always having a negative attitude, wallowing in negativity, is never the answer. And so being able to be self aware enough to say, you know what, I'm at risk of letting this keep hitting me over the head. It's already hit. You know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to change it and be better than that. And I'm going to use that to turn me in a positive way. That to me is a really aspirational sort of response to a stressful situation or a bad life experience. And when we see that in other people, we credit it. And we love those comeback types of stories as part of the human experience, because it really illustrates the potential that we all have, but we don't give ourselves that same grace as often, which is something I'm going to come back to when we talk about solutions in a few minutes here, I'm sure. But this idea of looking out not just for ourselves for self awareness, but being part of other people's solutions as well. And so I'll
Mhm.
just leave that as a teaser for the moment.
Perfect. Well, I like that, and that line you said, don't let burnout win twice. I think is great. I mean, ideally, you don't want to let it win once, but if it does, don't let it happen. Don't let it win a second time. I think that's very wise. So let's do it. Let's transition into the solutions portion. So, what are some steps we can take to prevent and recover from it? So we'll talk about this again from an organizational perspective and an individual perspective. Let's start with the organization. So, what are the things that an organization can do to help identify burnout in their employees or team members? Not only identify it, but also support them through that.
Yeah. So I think the identification piece of it really comes down to awareness. Um, and there is a caution here in that it's probably unhelpful to get into a situation where, for example, and this is hypothetical, employees come into a business and as part of their check-in they fill out a burnout screening inventory, and their boss gets a report, and Jane's dealing with some burnout over the last 3 months, and Jake's doing pretty well, because it's too easy in that situation for the leaders themselves to misuse that information because they don't fully understand that this is a human experience. And unless they really lean into helping everyone reach their fullest potential, there is potential in an unsafe way for people to have disclosed sensitive information about where they're at. And so I think from an organizational standpoint, it's really important to not focus on singling out individuals, but focus more on what working environment are you creating? How are you helping in a global sense your employees connect with meaning, values, and purpose in what they do? And so if we go back to drivers of burnout, there's a whole list of these, and we can rattle them off: workload, sense of control at work, having both intrinsic and extrinsic reward from your work, connecting with community, being treated fairly, and aligning with your values. Those are things that aren't just for individuals to try to connect with. They're critical for organizations to self reflect. We talk about people being individually self aware. Organizations need to be self aware. How are we helping our staff in whatever job role they're in whatever profession they're in, connect with meaning, values, and purpose through appropriate workloads, opportunities for people to restore themselves and recover? They'll work hard because there's a mission, but we also give people the opportunity to go back and recharge and restore their energies by understanding that when they have more complete home lives, they're better at work too, because we aren't just isolated, siloed, switch on, I'm at work, switch off, I'm at home kind of people. This is integrated for most of us. What am I doing in my change management processes when a new policy is coming forward in my workplace? Do I tell my staff this is the way it is, like it or leave? Or am I engaging people so that they feel a sense of agency in the decisions that affect them, which then builds engagement and is a mitigator for burnout? And in a lot of professions, that's a foreign concept. You work here, I'm your boss, you do what I say. Increasingly, we're understanding that that does not foster engagement in the workplace and doesn't sustain a working environment where people feel like they're part of a team. They feel like they're a servant, frankly. And that's not where work is going. And so I think organizations can really focus on how do we look at those drivers, explore which ones are most problematic or most opportune in our environment, and then lean into those. One other quick example is maybe in a certain workplace, people don't have a sense of team, a sense of connection. What can you do to build that sense of honoring and valuing each other as human beings, as part of a team together? It doesn't mean everyone has to like each other a ton. I mean, sometimes it can just be respect. But there is team building that is really important so that people feel like they belong to something larger than themselves. And if that is achievable, and I think it is in any job, if that's achievable, you've already set up an environment as an organization that is ripe for success. And you don't need the specific individual band-aids or, immediate quick fixes, because you've actually built a foundation that feels supportive from the very beginning.
That's great. And now, it's sort of in closing, let's look at it from the individual's perspective. So we've talked a lot about how do I start to identify early signs of burnout and what to be on the lookout for and those types of things. What would you say to that individual that comes and say, "Hey, I listen, I'm checking all the boxes right here, and I'm meeting criteria. I feel burnout. I need help." What would you say to that individual?
So I think the first most important piece to this is people need to get out of their tendency to blame themselves and feel guilty about the experience, because this is common. And just because your buddies aren't saying it doesn't mean they're not experiencing it too. And so this is a normal human experience, and you don't need to beat yourself up over it. This is largely driven by your workplace environment. And that doesn't mean that your workplace has to be, a pit of despair. Sometimes it's just the way that's hitting the rest of your life. But I think giving yourself grace to have a human experience, but then to your point earlier about how do we move this to something that we can grow from and become better and improve upon, being self-aware and committed to yourself in a way that allows you to connect with meaning, values, and purpose more effectively. And so thinking about, well, is my workload manageable? Is that my problem? Sometimes it might be, in which case you've got to realistically step back and say, you know what? I've been burning the candle on both ends to meet these deadlines. I am not going to be able to continue to do this. My career is a marathon, and I've gone out like I'm running a 400 meters, and I'm going to bonk. this is this is not healthy for my career. That takes self-awareness, and that's something I think people sometimes need to do. It might be something different. Again, going to community. It might be, you know what? I'm isolated at work. I like my job, but I don't feel like there's something bigger than me. What am I going to do about that? Well, what are the team building activities? What are the reaching beyond yourself to engage with your colleagues and connect as human beings? Sometimes that requires a little bit of, getting slightly outside of your comfort zone, giving a little effort to get a lot more reward. And that requires a personal assessment and judgment. That self awareness piece is really critical, but it needs to come from a place that's not judgmental. And so that starts to get into sort of mindfulness kinds of practices where we are observers of our state without judging it. And that allows you to move forward in ways that aren't laden with guilt and allow you to problem solve for a greater goal. And you want to thrive in your career, you want to achieve to your fullest potential. Your organization wants that, your boss wants that. You want to be more effective if you're already in a leadership position, you got people working for you. All of this allows elevation at every level. And so stepping back to that 30,000-foot view and realizing this is a challenge, but it's one that I can objectively address without stigmatizing the concept of trying to improve this. And that's why I like the last piece I'll say about this is I like to try and turn the framing as quickly as possible from how do I get out of burnout to how do I thrive and flourish more fully? Because wherever you are on that spectrum that you mentioned earlier, there's an improvement that you can make. And it might be, hey, I'm experiencing terrible symptoms of burnout right now. I need to alleviate those. Okay, that's a step. But why are you doing that? You're doing that because you want to be taking steps forward toward your fullest potential. If you're already doing pretty well in many dimensions, there are some other things that you might be able to fine tune. But rather than resting on your laurels and just sort of accepting, well, what I'm doing right now is fine, there are things you can improve to get more towards thriving and flourishing, and then allowing yourself to say, where am I? And every step that I take is a success. The final thing I'll say about individuals as part of the solution here is we don't give ourselves enough credit for what we bring to the table. We also need to model that by telling others how much we value what they bring to the table. And if we can bring an environment in our workplace, no matter what your job is, of appreciation and gratitude for each other, that elevates the spirit of an entire workforce. And we just don't do it enough. In medicine, in particular, we do amazing things. And my colleagues are inspiring. And their professionalism and what they do for patients, whether they're in a clinical role or they're a volunteer at the front door helping give someone directions. I pass people in the hallways and hear snippets of conversations constantly that remind me of my why in what I do. How often do we go to those people and say, I just want you to know that what you do, I appreciate and keep doing it. And I know nothing, everyone's got challenges and there's stuff probably everyone has, but I want you to know that what you do matters and I see it. That makes us feel better as well because now we're connecting with a larger human experience. We don't talk about that much in burnout intervention literature, but I do think it's something that we need to think about. It's not artificial. It's not false gratitude. It's genuine appreciation for what we bring individually and for what the people around us contribute. And suddenly, what you start to see when you recognize your colleagues, they'll start to share back with you what they appreciate about what you do. And then suddenly you're connecting with meaning, values, and purpose because other people are reminding you, hey, what you do, pretty cool too. Thank you for doing what you do. And it can be a mundane job or it can be something that feels totally unique. Um, it doesn't matter. Everything that we do, we can honor that contribution. And it can be as simple as I don't mean to pick on fast food. It's an honorable industry, and I'm a partaker. Um, but even at the drive-through, do you say thank you? Something as simple as thank you when you get your order. And I know so many people that just they take their order, they like, reach, grab it back into the car, and they're off without even a word. Like this person is just a robot with no emotion or feeling, or there's no value to what they do. And something as simple as eye contact and thank you goes a really long way. And I think would benefit all of us across society beyond just the professions that we're in.
Oh, this is great, Colin, and I appreciate. I love the way you break it down there, and I've been taking a lot of notes as we've gone. So there's been a lot of things that I've picked up in this that have been a real surprise to me. So as we kind of wrap this up, I'll run through sort of the biggest learning facts and take home points for me. One, I like thinking about this conceptually as having burnout having three main qualities or characteristic. The first being emotional exhaustion, second being depersonalization, and the third, a decreased sense of personal accomplishment. So I think those are three very clear things for folks to look out for. I also like that you highlighted that this is a problem that's usually sustained over time. This is not acute stress or fatigue or being tired. This has to be chronic and sustained over a long period of time, and it really exists on a spectrum. So if on one side of that spectrum you have burnout, on the opposite end of that spectrum you have flourishing and thriving. And we don't have to wait until we get all the way to the end of the line of burnout before we start making changes. As soon as you feel like you're not thriving and flourishing, maybe time to go ahead and make some changes. And I also like at the end, a couple of good points that you brought up were one, give yourself some grace. This is a very normal human experience. Everybody experiences certain levels, and we're all on a different spot in that spectrum. So giving ourselves grace in that, and also giving ourselves grace to try to improve it. And when trying to get out of a feeling of burnout, important, not don't think about just running away from burnout, but think a little bit about running towards thriving and flourishing, and take somebody with us when we go, because others around us are probably experiencing the same thing. So that was fantastic. So let's here in 30 seconds see if we can answer the three big questions. So I'll call those back out to you. So number one, what is burnout and how is it different from stress or general exhaustion?
So burnout is a work-related human experience, normal response to workplace stressors with key dimensions of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, reduced sense of personal accomplishment. And although it overlaps with many other aspects of distress, including exhaustion, fatigue, stress in general, uh, it is workplace specific and aligned with those three particular dimensions.
Good. And our second question, what are the primary personal and organizational consequences of burnout?
Fundamentally, the consequence is that people are not able to work to their fullest potential. They're not able to grow to their fullest potential. And so that's different in different professions. In medicine, that means interactions with patients are not optimal. It means people will reduce their workloads sometimes to try to protect themselves. And they can also, at the individual level, be more prone to issues of mental health concerns, uh, knowledge acquisition deficits, things like that. But fundamentally, and at the simplest level, the consequence for people and the organizations they work within are that they're not able to function to their fullest potential. And that is not what people want individually. And it's not what organizations want for them. So everyone really has a reason to care about helping people meet whatever their individual optimal state could be.
Great. And then lastly, what are the steps we can take to prevent and recover from burnout?
So the first is to recognize it. and not just sort of muddle along. Yeah, things aren't right, but I don't know what's going on, and I don't have time to think about that. So, acknowledging that this is a thing and it's common across society in every job role is the first step. Solving a problem requires that you acknowledge that it exists. And then moving forward, thinking about how can you more optimally connect with meaning, values, and purpose, which commonly is routed through a manageable workload, building sense of community, being treated fairly, all of those drivers that we talked about, intrinsic, extrinsic reward, connecting with all of those things with your individual flavor is the path forward to starting to not just recover from burnout, but move along that continuum more toward thriving and flourishing, as you mentioned.
Right. And as you all know, we're very solution oriented here on the Human Optimization Project. And so obviously the solution to this is big and it is complex, but we want to help get you started on that process. So our challenge that we have for you, our call to action after this sessions, sit down, take 10 minutes, this will be less than 10 minutes. I want you to sit down and write out the following 6 categories that I'm going to list for you. And then you're going to go through each of these and decide if each of these things is worsening your stress and burnout or if it's helping you to prevent burnout. So those 6 things are your workload, your connection or sense of community, your control over your work life and schedule, the rewards you receive, your values alignment, your personal values compared to your work values, and then respect and fairness. And then for each of those 6 items, write down if that is either worsening your stress and burnout or if it is helping you prevent burnout. Once you do that, choose one of the items that's worsening your stress and burnout and see if you can have any positive impact in that area. Colin, any other advice for our audience as they go through that exercise?
So, really helpful exercise. Don't feel like you have to do something in every category. And one of the lenses that I recommend to people is think about what is most accessible within your sphere of influence. And so sometimes, you know what? I don't control my workload. The only thing I can do to control my workload is go part time or quit my job. That may not be the best solution in many circumstances. So, 2 areas that commonly are within people's sphere of influence immediately are connection or community, because we can always reach out to our colleagues and expand our networks, share experiences. That doesn't mean that you have to, overshare, over disclose, but just building that connection. And you'll find that you have commonalities with people that you work with that help everyone with a foundation of support. And we know that drives engagement and well being. It's really, really important to resist this social isolation that even the US Surgeon General has commented on, an epidemic of loneliness in the United States across all professions. And so, connection and being intentional about building that, all of us can do that. And then the second one is thinking about within the rewards domain, both looking outward and helping be part of other people's extrinsic rewards. How do they feel valued? I can help you feel valued by acknowledging all the things that you do that I appreciate, but maybe I don't bother to say anything. Well, start recognizing that. Build a culture of positivity and appreciation. And from an intrinsic reward standpoint, within ourselves, really be selfish about connecting with meaning, values, and purpose. And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek because being selfish in this regard is actually going to allow you to connect with your work more effectively and have a more fulfilling both work aspect and more global life as a whole. And so, if we are selfish about connecting with meaning, values, and purpose, we are going to be more fulfilled, more complete human beings, and we are going to meet our optimal potential.
All right, optimizers. So that does it for today. Dr. West just did a fantastic job walking us through this topic: burnout decoded, strategies for individuals and organizations to understand it, prevent it, and overcome it. This is a huge concept with a lot of value and many great take home points. Dr. West, thank you so much for walking us through this today.
My pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for putting this entire program together. I appreciate you for that.
You got it. You got it. To our audience, thank you all for joining us. And as always, remember to live intentionally, consistently, better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be and never stop optimizing. Thank you for tuning in to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project. If you enjoyed this session, please subscribe and leave a review so others can find us. If you know anyone else that would benefit from this discussion, please share this episode to join us in our mission to help as many people as possible become the best humans they can be. That's all for today, but we want to hear from you. Email us at optimize@mayo.edu to let us know how you're progressing in your own human optimization journey and tell us what topics you want to hear about in the future. For more helpful tips and content, be sure to follow us on Instagram, X, and YouTube.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon for medical, professional, or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified professional for any questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions expressed by the guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.